Well, hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum. This session, a keynote speech on innovation to decarbonize cities, building a national approach. I'm Professor Greg Clark. I'm chair of the Connected Places Catapult, and I'm chair of something called the Cities Commission for Climate Investment, 3CI. What I'm going to try to do during this keynote is to review the role that cities and the built environment play in the decarbonisation of our planet, and at the same time raise some critical challenges that we face in trying to succeed in the decarbonisation of cities. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the problems of time and the problems of money. And I'm going to describe 3CI as a development and innovation that we've created in the United Kingdom of a national nature to try to accelerate innovation in relation to both of those problems. But let's start by taking a step back and just reviewing what our agenda will be today. We'll talk about cities and the climate challenge firstly, and what a net zero city might look like. Then we'll talk about why local leadership on its own may be insufficient and why a national dimension can be important. Then we'll focus our attention on unlocking financial innovation. And lastly, I'll talk about the 5 areas of work that 3CI is developing, ending with an invitation to anyone who wants to join us in the work that we're doing. If we start right back at the beginning with the big picture, we're entering the 5th decade of the century of cities. In the top left-hand corner of my slide, you can see the arc of global urbanization from 1980, where roughly 40% of the world's then almost 6 billion people were living in cities, to 2080, where 85% of the world's then 10.5, perhaps even 11 billion people will be living in cities. So if you want to think about this in the most simple way, we're moving from an urban population of roughly 3 billion in 1980 to roughly 9 billion in 2080. I like to say to people that the simple way to understand the future is that 10 billion people will be living in 10,000 cities. And of course, there are all sorts of reasons why 10 billion people living in 10,000 cities can be a good thing. On the one hand, we know that cities are good at reducing poverty and encouraging social mobility. Cities, of course, are good for productivity. They make workers, firms, and capital more productive. They contribute to economic development. Per capita, and other things being equal, cities are actually the most environmentally efficient way to manage large populations. And they also, of course, increase trade and connectivity, and they produce revenues and asset values, and they're a good way to manage population. But everybody knows that there's a difference between what we might call good urbanization and bad urbanization. And too often what we see is bad urbanization, what I like to call the cost of chaos. It's carbon intensive and congested, it's unequal and inefficient, it's unsafe, and it's overcrowded. And urbanization in this context creates more problems than solutions. If you like, the pace of population growth and the development of the economy outstrips the carrying capacity that individual cities have, and we end up with these side effects, these negative externalities of huge intensified carbon, congestion, and everything else. On the other hand, we know that good urbanization is possible. There are enough places around the world where we see that population growth and economic change are not things that outstrip the carrying capacity of the city, but can be twinned with investment in the carrying capacity through investment in infrastructure, in the built environment, in utilities, the use of new connected technologies, much smarter systems of management and growth, that it is possible to have urbanization where population growth and carbon emissions can be, as it were, decoupled from that population growth so that we can see the effects of good urbanization all around the world. So the choice that we face as a civilization, as a world, is not a choice between whether we have urbanization or not, but whether we have good urbanization or bad. Now, a very stark way of looking at this is to look at the chart on the left-hand side that shows you that population growth that I've just been describing. 2.3 billion people living in cities in 1980, 9.3 billion people living in cities in 2080. You can see below that 275 cities of more than 1 million people in 1980, 1,600 cities of people with people of more than 1 million in 2080. And you can see down the right-hand side which regions of the world are the fastest urbanizing and where, as it were, the population growth will be. Some of you will, of course, note that we think that the fastest growing regions in the world may be the Arctic regions in the 2070s and the 2080s, for all the reasons that will be obvious to people now. So this quest for good urbanization rather than bad urbanization, and the quest to decouple carbon emissions from global population growth that will be increasingly settling in 10,000 cities, is the key quest of our time. Otherwise, global population growth and global urbanization become simply accelerators of carbon emissions, accelerators of global warming, and therefore hastening a future which will produce an unlivable planet. So when we think about why it is that cities have become so important, and I'm very grateful here to the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Global Carbon Project, and the Foundation BNP Paribas, who've produced this excellent infographic, you can see that on the left-hand side, the contribution of cities to global warming is very clear. It's electricity, it's commercial and residential buildings, it's ground transportation, but it's also industry. And as urbanization will continue in all the ways I've just described, if we continue urbanization under conditions of bad urbanization, we'll of course accelerate the carbon emissions. And on the other hand, cities can take action to reduce emissions through urban planning, through technology, through behavioral changes, and so much more. And if we're able to do that, we can decouple urban population growth from carbon emissions and begin to redress climate change in this very key area. Now, when we look at the world's cities, there are all sorts of reasons why cities should be concerned about climate change. There's not just, of course, what we've been talking about, which is that urban populations are growing, and as populations grow under conditions of bad urbanization, carbon intensity increases and urbanization becomes an accelerator of global warming rather than a decelerator. But there's also what this chart shows you, I think, very clearly, that cities are the places, the asset clusters, the infrastructure systems, the population concentrations that are vulnerable to many particular impacts of climate change. And in this one, we're looking at sea level rises. As global temperatures rise and sea levels rise, if we rise above the 2 degrees of maximum temperature growth that was established at Paris at COP21, then we see more than 500 cities become vulnerable to flooding from those sea level rises that will occur. So cities are not just emitters of carbon with a choice about whether to pursue a good urbanization path that will reduce carbon or a bad urbanization path that accelerates carbon, but cities are also probable victims of climate change. As sea levels rise, many cities are vulnerable. But cities are also the places, of course, where it's possible to innovate. One of the reasons that cities are so successful as a form of human settlement is that they create the conditions for innovation. So it's within our cities where it's possible to make adjustments and to innovate in ways that will reduce carbon and produce that good urbanization effect. So when we think about what good urbanization might look like, and we translate it into a conversation about carbon, I think we can begin to say that two things become very clear to us. The first thing that's clear is that the net zero path involves both an energy switch, the move towards renewable and sustainable forms of energy, but also an urban transition. The energy switch on its own will not decarbonize the planet unless there's an urban transition in our vehicles, in the way we consume, in the buildings that we use. And if we put together the mobility systems and the built environment systems of our cities, they represent over 75% of all the carbon emitted in cities. So we know that the urban transition is just as important as the energy switch. We do need to move towards buildings that are able to accommodate new forms of energy. We need to regulate and accelerate the shift towards low carbon transport systems. We need to produce circularity in our energy, our waste and our water systems if all of this is to work. So a simple way of understanding what the net zero city is to say that firstly, it must be clean. It has energy efficiency, the decarbonisation of electricity and waste prevention. It's a clean city. It has to be a connected city, mass transit options, active transport, and a much better approach to freight and logistics to reduce congestion, to decarbonise them. And of course, it needs to be compact. The city needs to be based on frugal uses of land, developing livable density with high amenity activities clustered together in the same place, so that we don't simply spread people out, producing the need for people to travel greater distances and the need to service people living in increasingly remote or distant location. The compact city is a sharing city, a city where space is shared, where amenities are shared, and where people live in formats which enable the use of high capacity transport systems by people moving from point to point much more frequently. So the net zero city needs to be clean, it needs to be connected, and it needs to be compact. And these things need to be underpinned by three other things. Much better mixtures of land use that are now possible in many countries in a post-industrial age, increasing materials efficiency and the use of new kinds of materials that are lighter, more resilient, more circular, and of course also electrification, the electrification as the mechanism to move from fossil fuels to renewables in both our buildings and in our transport systems. Now, all of this also, of course, can be supported by a behavior change approach using incentives, nudges, charges, demonstration effects. And in cities where network effects are particularly strong, the ability to change citizen behavior in our cities is a really key thing that cities and city leaders bring to this task. So we know something now, not just about the net zero path requiring both an energy switch and an urban transition, but we also understand what net zero carbon cities will look like, how they will operate, and all of the things that we need to reform in cities of all different sizes and in all different continents around the world. Now, as we move towards the net zero city, of course, business model reform is required, not just in energy, but as I've been saying, in transport, in real estate, in waste, in logistics, in water, and in so much more. And that's the active transition process that's now going on. What I would call the urban transition is in play. If we're successful in building these zero carbon cities, we don't just reduce carbon emissions and in the long term contribute to reduction in global warming and all of the damage that's causing. We can also use the zero carbon city as an agenda setting device for many other things. Obviously, it can improve health and quality of life, not least through the air quality that people are able to breathe, and the water quality that people are able to drink, and the quality and proximity of food, for example. We can also, of course, engage in environmental protection by avoiding sprawl, by having compact cities which are able to, as it were, set their footprint and not go beyond it. Of course, the zero carbon city will produce lots of cost savings for cities, for citizens and for companies, not just in their energy bills, but in their construction bills, in the value of their buildings over time, and so much more. Net zero carbon cities, of course, will be great producers of green jobs. There'll be cities where innovation is spurred, and there'll be improved efficiency in the way that streets, public space, utilities, and so much more work. We think there will also be improved service quality that comes from this, especially, for example, in decarbonized transport modes, our dependence on the internal combustion engine, and move much more towards mass transit systems that will have better service quality. These, of course, will be part of an enhanced mobility approach. And as I said right at the start, that will produce cleaner air, which will translate into much healthier lifestyles, especially for people, often poorer people, living in areas where the air quality is the worst. So there are all sorts of reasons why we should champion the zero carbon city, not just because we want to reduce carbon emissions and arrest global warming. Now, there are two big problems that we face as we try to pursue the net zero carbon model. One of them is time, and the other one is money. Of course, let's start with money and say that the investment required in the urban transition that I've been describing to you is much greater in volume than public budgets can afford in any normal public finance cycle. So on the money side of things, this is going to have to be a public and a private endeavor, where private sector capital is matched with appropriate investment and lending opportunities that are part of that urban transition. The second challenge we face, of course, is time. Time is important to us because we need to get to the point where we have substantially reduced carbon emissions by 2050 if we're going to arrest this challenge of global warming. And therefore, the investments need to be made now, even though they'll have a payback over a 30 to 40-year time period. So this time challenge that we face, time is running out, as we know. This time challenge that we face requires us to innovate in the financial models that we use so that financing is available now, even though the payback will occur over a longer period of time. Now, myself and my colleagues and my friends at the Connected Places Catapult and at 3CI have been thinking about this challenge for some time. We realize that as we've entered the 2020s, and here we are in 2023, the good news is that there are some new additional tools that are available to us. So if we think about the decarbonisation of cities, it's not just the power of local government or of metropolitan governance, the normal tools of public governance, land use planning, and infrastructure that are available to us, but there are other additional tools that we can draw upon. So one of them is obviously the new generation of enabling technologies, exponential technologies and applications that are now available to us to enhance how cities functions, how urban economies are driven, but also to improve the performance of transport systems, buildings, and so much more. So enabling technologies are a key part of the solution. A second new tool is intentional capital. It's become very clear, has it not, that amongst the investment community, whether it's pension funds and insurance companies, banks and private equity, sovereign wealth funds, venture capital, special investment funds, and others, there is a renewed commitment to tackling climate change as they have woken up both to the challenge of climate change in the longer term, and particularly its ability to destabilize asset values, but also the realization that urban assets have become much more investable and investment ready, given that long path of human population migration towards the city that I described at the beginning. And then the third new tool that we think is available is what I would like to call place leadership, the new approach to combining efforts at the local level, where local government is a convener, but where institutions, corporations, investors, citizens, community groups, and so much more are increasingly finding ways to work together to re-engineer their places for the lifestyles that we want to have in the future, and to create, as it were, collaborative ventures that do that, rather than expecting one individual entity to be able to lead place on its own. So collaborative place leadership is one of our new and very important tools. Now, we've heard a lot over the last 10 to 20 years about how individual cities are making progress on climate change using the kinds of approaches that I've been speaking about. But one of the concerns that we have is that many of the cities that we hear about are the larger cities where there are, as it were, more capable institutions. They're often capital cities or cities with a large investable asset or infrastructure base. One of the concerns that we've had thinking about this in the UK is that we have many, many medium-sized cities in the UK. And we know that attracting investment in any significant amount requires a scale of opportunity that is perhaps only available to very, very large cities on their own, or potentially to groups of cities working together. And so what we have done in the United Kingdom is to bring together a group of cities, London plus the 11 other largest cities in the country. And now we've added another 30 or 40 medium-sized cities from the Key Cities group and from Scotland, alongside the core cities and London councils, so that we now have organised the greatest part of urban Britain to try to work together on this challenge through the Cities Commission for Climate Investment. So what is 3CI? Well, it's a UK-wide initiative, as I've explained. We see it as a big partnership between the UK's biggest cities, many of which are small in global terms, but they're our biggest cities, the innovation agency that is the Connected Places Catapult, and the financial sector. And the idea here is that the cities, the innovation agency, and the financial sectors work together to secure investment for net zero locally. What we see ourselves as doing is adding a national platform or dimension to local leadership. This is not instead of local leaders taking a lead with their decarbonisation strategies, but it's about us working together to put those local opportunities into a program where they become bankable and investable for the private sector. So the focus is very much on financial innovation. We say that we innovate new investment approaches, we accelerate collaboration between local and national governments, industry and financial institutions, and we advocate for future changes in the approach to investment across both local and national government to make decarbonising investment much more possible. So our organisation, as you can see, includes the leaders of many of the United Kingdom's significant cities and significant city groupings. Our advisory board oversees the work, and we have a series of work programs that are designed to accelerate that net zero carbon investment across the United Kingdom cities over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to talk about each of these programs of work briefly in a moment, but simply let me say that the first one is a national net zero project pipeline, as it were, putting together in a combinable and aggregatable form all of the local projects that are about decarbonisation to try to create a portfolio of different kinds of opportunities. The second one is what we call net zero neighbourhoods, a focus on how we can build a new financial and operational model for residential neighbourhoods so that they can accelerate decarbonisation right now. The third one is an innovation platform through which we share knowledge and ideas of what's working in different parts of the United Kingdom and indeed different parts of the world where cities have taken initiatives which have attracted private sector co-investment. The fourth area of our work is regional investor exchanges, where we bring together city governments with investors to focus on the opportunities within individual regions and to build the rapport between cities and investors in a way that's guided by a set of approaches that are well understood by everyone. And then lastly, we're investing in an investable cities program, trying to build the long-term capability, competence and confidence of local government to work with private investors to drive their net zero strategies. So let me just tell you a little bit more about each of these. The net zero project pipeline has begun with an invitation to local governments to share with us all of the projects that they would like to bring forward to implement their net zero strategies. And we've worked with them to put them together into a series of project typologies. Some of them are about local heat networks. Others are about retrofitting of buildings. Some are about decarbonisation of transport. Some are about, for example, the purchasing of electric buses or the shifting towards cycle hire schemes and so much more. And with each of these projects, we've then created this capacity for portfolio packaging of the work in such a way that a private investor might be invited not just to invest in one project of this type in one city, but potentially to invest in the retrofitting, for example, of leisure facilities across 30 cities at the same time, creating a different kind of scale than would otherwise exist and creating an opportunity for several investors to invest in the same portfolio, thus to share some risks together of a portfolio that would be able to produce a scale of return. So a large number of projects. We have over 900 projects now from more than 50 local and regional authorities, each of them developed in a way which are compatible with one another and therefore aggregatable into portfolios packaged together so private investors can become more interested in them. Over the course of this year, you'll hear much more from us about this. Our second big project is called Net Zero Neighborhoods. Here, the idea is to enable individual neighborhoods through a choice made by that neighborhood to accelerate their own process of decarbonisation at the local level, premised on some very important ideas. The first idea is that if you're going to decarbonise a neighbourhood, you have to decarbonise multiple assets within that neighbourhood at the same time, and you can see that modelled here. The second idea here is that neighbourhoods do this by consent. A neighbourhood will decide to become a net zero neighbourhood. And then the third proposition that's attached to that is that this will involve a new financial mechanism, essentially a management company being introduced into that neighborhood to accelerate the decarbonisation of all of the different elements that you can see here on the screen, and effectively to borrow the money to do that in a partnership with the private sector, where the benefits of the decarbonisation process are then shared between the householders themselves through the savings that they make in their energy bills, but also a revenue return then being made to the investors themselves in the longer term. Now, these net zero neighbourhoods, we've begun to model them in terms of the challenges that they need to overcome. We've started to understand how they will work in terms of the money that's going to be required, the co-benefits that will be produced at the place level, at the asset level, and through the blended finance, and then the organizational mechanisms that will be put in place to make it work. And you can see here on this slide a simple version of how this can come about. A combination on the left-hand side of some governmental funding with with buyout capital coming in, the private sector financiers investing in the decarbonisation of these activities, producing a set of outcomes which are not just the energy and maintenance savings, but a whole series of other co-benefits, including the investment returns, and then those returns being shared, as it were, between the different entities that have put together the investment package at the start. We think this is a model that can be now tried and tested in a multiplicity of locations to demonstrate that we can accelerate investment in order to start to save the carbon now, with a financial model where the co-benefits as well as the financial returns can then be achieved by the parties that are involved. And we think that this could be a radical way to begin the decarbonisation process in residential neighbourhoods of about 1,000 homes over the next years. We think that when this works, there will be two aspects to this. Years 1 to 4 will be about really engaging in the design, the implementation and the procurement. And then years 4 to 44 will be about the investment being made, the decarbonisation occurring, and all of the benefits then being shared. I want to talk now about our innovation platforms, where essentially we're involved in an exchange of innovative ideas. We're publishing case studies about what's working in terms of private finance for urban decarbonisation. We're also hosting multiple events where these things are discussed. And then our regional investor exchanges, which, as you can see, have already taken place in Bristol and Glasgow, and will soon in Birmingham and Leeds and London. And our insights publications that help to demonstrate how all of this is working. Our fifth program of work we call Investable Cities. This is about creating the capabilities within local government to unlock private sector investment. If you like, this builds upon ideas like the 100 resilient cities, or it builds upon some of the other models that have been developed by creating capability within local government, so that local governments are much more ready to bring forward bankable and investable propositions as part of their decarbonisation. Now, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today about our work. 3CI has been operating for 1 year so far. As you can see, we've developed 5 work programs that are designed in a practical way to build a new market for private sector investment in local decarbonisation in British cities, using a national platform for collaboration for this to occur. I want to warmly invite you to join us in whatever way you see as appropriate, and please make contact with us. You can see the 3CI web address here on my final slide. I wish everybody at the World Built Environment Forum great success. Thank you for listening to me, and we look forward to working with you to decarbonise British cities and to build a national model within the UK that is then an inspiration for other countries around the world as well. Thank you.